مساء الخير ومرحبا بكم في المركز الثقافي الأمريكي في الجزائر. This is Khaled, your embassy spokesperson, and we're glad to welcome you back to our weekly talks. We're going to be transitioning basically to doing one talk a week after Ramadan. So today's guest is a very special guest that we're super excited about having. Amal Kassir is a Syrian-American international spoken word poet who started off working as a waitress at her family's Syrian restaurant in Denver, Colorado, the Mile High City. And she has performed and taught in 13 different countries and cities all over the place, and venues ranging from orphanages to refugee camps to youth prisons to universities to churches. Her work is heavily influenced by the war in Syria and her experience as an other in the United States and the plight of the oppressed all over the world. So Amal is going to be talking about her experience living as a Muslim in the United States. Amal, thank you so much for joining us. Ahlan wa sahlan fiki.
Ahlan fiki, ya Khaled. Thank you very, very much for having me. And I thank the U.S. Embassy in Algiers for allowing me the opportunity to be here. I wish it was in person and that I could meet everybody. But next year, inshallah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. My name means hope in Arabic. I would imagine you all know that. But I always make sure whenever I meet anybody here in the United States who doesn't speak Arabic, that is what my name means. I have a unique background. Most of my friends, both their parents come from overseas. But for me, I am the daughter of an Arab man from Syria, and I am the daughter of an American woman from Germany. I'd like to begin with a poem to give you an idea about the world where I come from. My body is made of two types of blood, German and Syrian. Rhine River and Nahr al-Furat, I am split tongue, Sald, Bald, Ain, Ghain on one side, Makshnel on the other. Mama fed me meatloaf with a side of fattoush. She'd wrap peanut butter and jelly visage. Some days it was just salt and pepper. Others, it was cardamom, caraway, cumin, and coriander. My world was a very colorful spice rack. Before bed, my mom would sing us nursery rhymes and then recite us Quranic verses. She would tell us stories of the founding fathers of the United States, and then stories of Umar bin Khattab and Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu anhuma. And this woman, with an entirely different alphabet to her soup, would share her secrets across the ocean with my Arab grandmother. Two women, different recipes in their blood, but they still had the same libraries on their fingertips. But you see, my mama had hair colored like corn, green eyes, the softest tongue, couldn't pronounce the alphabet that was my father's language. And Tete didn't know a single European recipe. Her plump fingers perfected Yabra, Arab-chested and hazel-eyed, 14 children made her an expert in motherhood. When Mama and Tete spoke, they would use the braille of their palms to ask our foreheads if we were sick. They could tell how much we ate just by looking at us. And these women, with entirely different recipes in their blood, had the same libraries on their fingertips. You see, I'm something like Pangea, bones of Damascus steel sized to a German skeleton. Lisani ma bihtaj warning before switching from one lugha to another. My tongue can go from Colorado sunsets to saqba after rainfall. When I was born, I had no national anthem to my lips. I did not know the words Tahiyyat al-Alam or the Star-Spangled Banner. The only language I spoke was whatever was in my mother's holy hands. And 7 years after my birth, the first time I visited Syria and I met my Arab grandmother, I swear, it's like I was already familiar with this language in her palms. And maybe that's because I'm like rivers, split tongue. Sod, dal, ayn, ghain on one side, makshnen on the other. Thank you, shukran. That's poem number 1. I don't know if you can tell, but my lahja is very Suri. That's what they tell me. People, the second they hear me speak Arabic, they know where I'm from. So I hope you enjoyed that piece, combining the different worlds that I have. But to give you a little more detail about who I am and where I'm from, when people ask me, what does home mean to you? I tell them my home is the mountains of America. The city I was born in is called Denver, Colorado. Now, most people only know either New York or Hollywood in America, right? But in the very middle of the country, you will find the biggest, most beautiful mountains. And at the foot of those mountains is where I was born. I spent most of my childhood in the United States. And when I was 7 years old, after September 11th, my father decided he wanted us to go to Syria so we can learn the language, so we can learn the culture, because being American, being American after September 11th, it meant that our identity was being told to us. And Baba wanted to make sure that we learned our other half directly from the source. When people ask me, what is your identity? This is a very complicated question, and I could probably talk hours on it. But I am a Syrian-American Muslim. That's what it all comes down to. I consider both my parents to be immigrants. Baba came to the United States from Syria. But my mother, she has an interesting story. A story that I think much of the Arab world tends to forget about this piece of Islam. And when my mother was 15 years old, Aslamat, she took her Shahada and she became a Muslim. So in a way, my mom is an immigrant. She's an immigrant into this vast new world, an immigrant into the lugha, an immigrant into the deen, into all of the pillars and all of the knowledge. And when you become a Muslim, you inherit all of the countries in the world. So now all of a sudden, she wasn't just an American convert. She possessed she had Malaysia on her back. She had Bosnia in her heart. She had Turkey and Syria and Palestine and Jazair and all of the Muslim nations across the world, now a part of her identity. And when you're born into Islam, you experience it differently. But when you take your Shahada, when you're at a certain point of your life, the experience is going to be different. Let's talk about some stereotypes. Now, of course, my mother's mother, her white American side of the family, they were so afraid that, my father was going to be a barbarian. He was going to be an Arab monster who would put her in niqab and they would never see her again and all of this stuff. And they had these crazy views about who my father was when he was just a 22-year-old man who moved to the United States. But on my father's side of the family, there were also some stereotypes. Who is this American girl? Does she have any morals, any values? Is she gonna raise your children right? Does she even know what she's doing? Her Islam is gonna be weak, right? You have these two different worlds with both their stereotypes, but if you listen closely, they're saying the same thing. We all have our racism. It's not just in America, it's everywhere. And it was something that my mother and my father had to learn how to remove from their own children. The truth is, growing up, I was never Arab enough, and I was never American enough. So I was always in the middle. So my identity always had to be studied, had to be recreated. I have another poem for you, and this one is very special to me. And I love my dad so much. He worked so hard. And in America, we have this phrase, which is the American dream. And the American dream is it's working hard, starting from nothing to give your family what they have. And there's different like political interpretations of what this is, but this is a poem from my father, and it's a true story. And here we go. I asked my father once what language he dreams in. And he did not know the answer to this question. In fact, it surprised him, confused him. My dad has spent more of his life here in America than in his own motherland. And here he is, a man who's mastered both languages, unsure of which he dreams in. I remember the only time I saw my father stutter. It was in a crowded grocery parking lot, and he did not have enough stars or stripes to muster a response to the bigot who called him something with an F word, an N word, and the word terrorist in it. It's like my father did not have the tongue to respond. Imagine that, a man without a tongue. He was tripping over his own voice like it was a herd of wild horses he could not tame. This man, my Baba, speechless? He is the son of a poet. He is the child of a mother of 14. He is an Arab from Lughat al-Dald. He possesses letters not found in any other dialect on this planet. A man whose own sister was deaf, that he helped create her language. He's managed to make friends from all over the world using his English or his Arabic or his Adab or whatever else he can find. My father, who makes sure to tell all his jokes in 2 languages so that more of this world can laugh with him. And still, my father did not have the tongue to respond to the bigot at the grocery store. I asked my father what language he dreams in, and he does not know the answer to this question. He spent more of his life here than in his motherland, a man who's mastered both languages, unsure of which he dreams in, probably because he dreams in both. My father gets his livelihood from our restaurants. He feeds people, caters to their taste buds, whatever culture they may come from. He couldn't pick one country, so he put Syria inside restaurants on American soil and made sure that everybody who walked in would have a brand new country in their mouths, so that even the bigot who walked into our restaurant would know that the American dream was dreamt up in another language. My father was not the type of man who stuttered. He was never speechless. The only explanation that I have is that maybe Allah decided that a man whose tongue is this powerful shouldn't even bother responding. Thank you. So I think when we talk about being a Muslim in America, I think we need to talk about the experience of Islamophobia, the experience of being anti-Muslim. And there is no doubt that this has shaped a lot of my identity as a Syrian-American Muslim. On September 11th, 2001, the whole world changed. There was 2 airplanes, hijackers, that flew into buildings in New York. And I was 6 years old. So I'm gonna tell this story from the perspective of a 6-year-old. We lost so many lives that day, American lives. And it led to wars that ended up taking the lives of thousands and thousands and thousands more. But as a child, I did not understand this. I was attending a private Islamic school on September 11th. And within an hour after the first building was hit, we received 2 bomb threats at my school. We don't know who, obviously. Somebody just calls up and says, you better get your Muslim children out. And so the whole school was evacuated. We all had to go home. And as a first grader, I didn't know what this meant. It just meant that I had 2 weeks off of school. And for the safety of the Muslim students, because things were not safe for Muslims, we had to stay home for 2 weeks. And this was the first time our parents had to figure out, what do we tell our children? What do we tell them when a man at the grocery store tells your mother to go back to her country? When people are setting hijabs on fire, people were throwing rocks through my family's restaurant, and the whole city, the whole country for Muslims became a horrifying place. But the thing is, because of our Islam, what would have been an experience for all of us to mourn, we could not mourn. We could not cry. We could not be sad with America. We had to be afraid because of the way the news portrayed it and because of who the hijackers were. Like I said in my TED Talk, we weren't allowed to be mourners. You know, we had to quickly jump to protecting ourselves and who we were. And it was a difficult time. But as a kid, I'm stumbling around thinking world peace is an easy matter. And I lived my life growing up trying to understand other people. Because when a terrorist attack does hit your home, how can you blame people for being afraid and angry? These are the most common fears. These are the most common reaction to things like this. But it depends on how we end up hearing the story and what story we choose to believe. I've had experiences of groups of men threatening to hurt me and to do other things. I've had experiences of violence, of threats, never a gun pointed at me, but definitely from my friends. On the YouTube comments, oof, wali ala auntie, man. The YouTube comments can be an ugly, ugly place. But subhanAllah, you know, the truth of the matter is, if you seek only the ugly, you will find the ugly. It also depends where you live. Where I live now, it has a way, way more Muslims. So they did not have, growing up, what we had. Where we had FBI, riot police inside of our mosque, tumbling over our bookshelves with their shoes on the carpet. And I mean, it was scary, especially for small towns, for small villages where people might be the only Muslims. But I think the landscape is changing. I want to tell you a story about the night that Donald Trump, remember that guy? Sometimes we forget ever since he got his Twitter taken away. I forgot about him. But the night that President Donald Trump was elected, I remember being so afraid. And so many of my friends were afraid. We really thought our lives would be in danger. And we thought that we would not be able to handle this and that and that something bad would happen to us, that violence would ensue. And in some places it did. But the night of the elections, in my fear, I called up not my American mother, I called up my Syrian father. And I asked him, Baba, what are we gonna do? Are we even safe anymore? And he said something to me that has stuck with me forever. He says, Amal, we are Americans and we belong here. It is our responsibility to make this a better country. So don't be afraid. I hung up the phone and I sat at this coffee shop I used to go to, thinking about what my father said, trying to understand what is our identity at the end of the day. You have a lot of Arabs here, a lot of people from Pakistan, India, Indonesia, all over the world who they come here, they have their citizenship, they pay their taxes, but they don't call themselves Americans. And for some of the things they've experienced, I cannot blame them. But for me, there's a war in my country in Syria. And at the end of it all, my mother was born and raised in America. And if Jannah is under your mother's feet, then there must be something special about this place. When trying to decide what my identity is, I have to ask myself the question, what does it mean to be an American Muslim? What does it mean to be an American or a Syrian or an Algerian or a French citizen, a Mexican, anywhere in the world? What does it mean? When some people think of America, they think beautiful women and big trucks and waving flags and fireworks. Some people see police officers shooting Black people in their homes. Some see farms and the sweat and brow of the men in rural villages who feed this country. Some see a whip on the back of a slave. Some see guns they cherish. Some see guns they fear. Everybody sees things differently. So how do we define our country? How do I choose what to call my America? Is it the television? Is it the leaders in office? Or is it my neighbors? Is it my friends? Is it the masajid that we will rebuild even if they're burnt down? Is it our skyscrapers of New York? Or is it our mountains of Colorado? Is it the police or the people protesting them? Is it nonprofit organizations or for-profit corporations? I end with the question, is life in America difficult? Well, when there are bombs falling in Syria, where I have lost 49 members of my family, how can I not be grateful? I choose a little bit of hostility on the television. I'll choose a little bit of aggression to the bombings. But the reality is, I don't know if it's about where you belong, but I think it's about what you're willing to create. I can't deny the situation in my country. I can't deny what's happening all over. The experience of Muslims in America is one that is difficult, and I think it's getting harder for the younger generation. For me, my personality is tough. I'm ready to fight, I'm ready to speak. I've got a poem for any stereotype you have. But for others, this is heavy and this is difficult. And that's why I believe that it is my duty to create an America that keeps people safe and keeps people connected and ensures that we stay strong in who we are, no matter what happens. My father is an immigrant. My mother is an immigrant. And no matter what, this is where I was born and this is where I belong. There is some qadr in that. I thank you all for listening. And even though I had like a very chirpy speech, don't be afraid to ask me any difficult questions because there are so many different tones of voice that we can use. May Allah bless you all, except your last 10 nights of Ramadan. And I thank you for spending time hearing me out as I've sat here all the way from Texas, United States. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Amal. Really loved your talk. For our listeners, keep on asking your questions for Amal in the live chat, and we'll ask them here. So I feel like after listening to your talk, and especially the second poem, that we kind of got to know your Baba. Like, I feel like I got a sense of what he's like as a person. Could we hear how he and your mother met?
Yes. Don't use this tip if you ever go to America, but it did work. So my father, along with like many different Syrian men, were shipped off to Nebraska, of all places. I'm sure when they imagined coming to America, it wasn't Nebraska, which is very flat, only farmland, very rural, no big fancy buildings. And he was attending the university. And according to my dad, he took one look at this beautiful blonde woman and he knew that she was the one. So what he did was he hired her to do his English homework. And he was paying her very good money. And that was his doorway. So she would do his English homework. And then he would, like, talk to her a little bit, see what she knows, what she likes. And one thing led to another, and the rest is history, as they say.
That's a really cute little story. So you of course had a TED Talk, which got, I think, 5 million views, more than 5 million views on YouTube. It's called Muslim on an Airplane, the Muslim on the Airplane. And you usually give that talk to Americans to let them know more about who Muslim Americans are, who you are personally. Can you tell us what your experience has been like as you've gone to these different venues? You said you went to prisons, to churches. How have Americans responded to your story?
I love this question because it is in my travels where my interpretation of people changed. If I only used television and Facebook to tell me who Americans were, I would have a very dark view, right? But overwhelmingly, I've literally been in auditoriums where everyone's wearing a Donald Trump hat, and I'm the first Muslim woman they've ever seen in their lives, not on television, right? And for these kinds of moments, like, I decided, do I want to be afraid when I speak to you, or do I want to just like an open menu at my restaurant? And people are kind. Politics doesn't determine morality. It can in some cases, but it doesn't always. And I usually talk about things that affect everybody. I do not use politics as my route. No way. I use humanity as my route. And I have connected deeply with men who've been in the US military who come up to me. They're like, I can relate to your stories. I understand this. Like, thank you for sharing. And these are two opposite worlds that you think would never mix together, right? I've had such beautiful, pleasant experiences with people. People who said, you changed my world. I see the world differently now because of you. So it's been overall very pleasant.
So we had a couple people asking food questions, and I'll kind of combine them. One was Ilyas Dakar, and I didn't get the other name. Oh, Salas Relicto, I guess. Anyways, I'll turn them into, could you tell us more about your family's Syrian restaurant in Denver and how that came about?
So when my father married my mother, they were living in that small town I mentioned. And to be honest, it wasn't a place to raise a family. It was very difficult to be there. My mother, who just started wearing hijab, they were a little nervous, they were a little scared, and my dad decided, let's go start a new life. And so they moved to the mountains. And when they got to the mountains, my father had this yearning to, it was a side hustle to kind of make a little bit of extra money. But he wanted to feed people. And when my father was in university, my grandma would send him cassette tapes. I don't know who is old enough to remember cassette tapes, but she would record her voice of the recipes. Things like harab asfao, things like kabsa, all of those things on these voice recordings, and she would mail them on tapes to the ocean. So my father learned how to cook using these lessons my grandmother gave her. And so when my mom and my dad moved to this new city to start a new family, on Fridays for Salat al-Jum'ah at the masjids, my dad and my mom would make all kinds of things, fatayr and hummus and labneh, and they would start selling them. And people loved it. And every Friday they would sell it. My grandma or my mom told me that they would have labneh inside of the bathtub, as it's just sitting there and becoming sour. And and I have all these stories of my grandfather bringing a goat into the backyard, and all of the people being like, what is wrong? Then people calling the police on my grandfather because of the goat. But they did everything they could to make these food and feed the people. And over time, my father was working at a donut shop. It's like these little cakes that we have here in America. And he worked so many hours and saved every penny he had and opened up the second Arabi restaurant in Colorado. And it made the cover of the newspaper. It's the biggest menu in Colorado, and all of the people who worked at my father's restaurant ended up one of the OGs, as they say.
I love the details of the lebna in the bathtub and the goat in the backyard. It's just very easy to imagine. Adia Bukris asks, exactly what advice do you have for young Muslims in the US who I guess who are going through the same process of trying to discover their identity and whatnot?
Such an important question. Learn your deen. Learn your religion. Know who your prophet is, because they will slander him. But Rasulullah was slandered back in the ancient times too. There were Pamela Geller equivalents back in the day. This experience that we're experiencing, if you read the history of Islam, the Sahaba experienced it too. Know your deen. Know your people. Connect with a masjid. And if you don't have access to a masjid, or you don't feel welcome, which happens a lot, I'm not going to say the Muslim community is perfect at all. We have our issues. But learn what your religion is. And if you're struggling with your faith, that's okay. You're in America. How can you not? How can you not know? We don't have an environment that teaches us things very clearly. But we have to get an education. We have to seek knowledge, and that is a very sacred path. And when you know who you are, you will be empowered. What happens a lot, I think, with young Muslims is they're like, oh my God, is Muslim really this barbaric terrorist religion? Are Muslims really violent? Are we really oppressing our women? Is this really what's happening? And they don't know. And you have the West telling them one thing and their parents telling them another thing. So how are they going to know who to be? Educate yourselves and be strong and go through this journey the best as you can. So that is my best advice for you all.
So there are a couple people, including Taqwa Tayyib, I think, who are asking about, they want to know more about how your mother at the age of 15, what made her become a Muslim?
Good question. So this speaks to the power of children. When my mother was in grade 6, which, what is that, like maybe 11 or 12 years old? When my mother was in grade 6, there was a girl from Pakistan in her class. This was the only Muslim girl in the city. And it was a very small town. And my mom became friends with this girl. And my mom was so curious about this girl, her religion, her culture, her food, everything. And my mom told me that even at a very young age, she said that she could never ever understand the idea of worshiping Jesus. And she told me growing up, she's just like, there were times when I asked the pastor at the church, I would ask him, well, who's Jesus praying to in the picture? And she would ask these like crazy questions that like kids don't ask. So كأن التوحيد كان بقلبها from the very, very beginning, But she met that girl from Pakistan in grade 6. And then a few years later, maybe about 4 years later, 3 or 4 years later, she met my dad. So her heart was already there, but then talking with my dad was the bridge into the religion officially. So that's how she became a Muslim.
Emil, we have a question. I didn't get what the name was, but you mentioned that you don't like to let anyone else define what an American is or who an American is, that you get to define yourself what it is to be from a certain country. Can you explain a little more about that for our Algerian audience?
Definitely. So I think I'm going to take some things I've heard. At my TED Talk, I wore an American flag hijab. This was a very bold move. And I thought I would get more anger from Americans, but really I got more anger from Muslims around the world. And can you blame them? If bombs are falling in Iraq with American manufactured, people are they're gonna be angry. And in my mind, I did not see, hello, I'm gonna represent the bomb droppers. No, that's not what I saw, even though that's what someone may interpret that flag to mean, right? So for me, standing up there, what did the American flag in my hijab actually mean to me? And to me, it predominantly meant, no, you will not tell me I am not American. I was born here. I was raised here. I was educated here. This is my country as much as it is yours. That was my biggest thing. Do I believe that the American flag has its representations in different ways? Absolutely. But for me, that's not what it is. And I cannot allow other people to tell me what American means. There are people who say, because you are Muslim, you are not American. And I cannot accept that. I cannot accept that. This is where I'm from. This is who I am. And this is qadar Allah. This is what has been chosen for me. So I think that's a little bit of what I mean. Again, I should write an essay about it so you can, so we can really unpack it. But that's essentially what it is, to make my own decision about what it is to be an American.
Great, thank you for that, Emil. Phoenix Tabit, I think it's sometimes hard to interpret YouTube usernames as actual names. Asks, how do you explain the lack of representation of the Muslim community in American society and politics and on screen? Assuming that is that you would agree with the assumption that there is a lack of representation.
I think that there's a lack of representation of normal Muslims. I think that what's happening right now is the only Muslims being represented are like super extreme liberal Muslims. And it's either in the fashion industry, it's either like celebrities who you don't even know are Muslim until they sport that fact. And I don't feel represented whatsoever. And I think it's an interesting thing though, because do we want to tell people, hey, we're normal like you? Or do we want to tell people, hey, we are who we are, we will show up as we are? And I would critique a lot of the representation of Muslims in the mainstream as attempting to normalize Muslims and almost perpetuating this idea that, yeah, we're freaks. So let's show you that we're actually normal when we adopt to this, this super hypersexual agenda. And when you always get people taking off their hijabs in American television. Yeah, they're representing us, but are they really? I don't think that the media is doing a good job whatsoever. But I also think that the duty does fall on the Muslims who choose to step up to the plate. And it's going to be a constant battle, because if we want to be represented in typical American television, there are shows that have done it right. And I'm trying to think. I'm pretty sure in a Marvel show there was just a Muslim. In Spider-Man, she was just there. No one talked about her hijab. No one did anything. No one said anything. Her character wasn't about her hijab. She just happened to have hijab on. And that, I believe, normalizing the visual appearance. But then you'll have other instances again where it's this attempt to make us seem like we are like everyone. And what happens with that, our values are not the same. They're not the same values, and that's okay. Our American values are the same, but when it comes to certain components of morality, overall, like we can't attempt to remove our own values to belong. And I disagree with this strongly. So I hope that answers your question. I think that we should just appear more, but I don't think our roles and our identity should be defined by Western media in the way that we see it, because it ostracizes those who are generally just normal Muslims, who aren't, model Muslims or makeup artist Muslims or Muslims in the fashion industry or Muslims in the Hollywood industry. We end up being these Muslims who are too extreme, even though we're just practicing normally. So there's a huge conversation in the United States about this, about who has the right to represent Muslims. And it's very, very tricky and very complicated. So I'll end there, Khalid.
Okay. Yeah, no, thanks for that. That's a really interesting point about the Muslim who's just on the screen without any discussion of it. So you were talking about on screen. What about in politics specifically? Because, right now there are 3 Muslims in Congress, which is a first. The first time there have been, I think, more than one at once. Do you think that matters a lot, or and what would you want to see? How would you want to see those Muslim Americans in Congress represent the community?
Absolutely. I think it matters so much, because now, having Representative Ilhan Omar, for example, I use her because she does cover her hair as well. She's very visibly a Muslim. It's very obvious she's a Muslim. And I think what's frustrating is that sometimes we take away from the fact that she's an amazing lawmaker and she's a passionate activist and she's very focused on her vision for the world. And we focus so much on the fact that she's Muslim, right? She earned her way into office. And so did the Palestinian woman from Michigan. So did a good friend of mine, Iman Juda in Colorado, is now one of the representatives. These are huge, these are amazing. And it's important to occupy spaces. Rashida Tlaib, that's the name. It's important for us to occupy these spaces. And it's going to take a long time before our presence in these spaces is normal. So it will continue being a conversation with regard to Ilhan Omar, for example. People will continue talking about her scarf. People will continue talking about the fact that she's a Muslim and this and that. But with all that aside, are they good lawmakers? Are they good figures in the community? 100%. And it is important that our perspective is present in these spaces, without a doubt. So kudos to them. I think it's interesting. If you even look at the map of America, Hollywood is way west and the White House is way east. So even in America, you see this polarity between television and between politics. So yes.
Great. So Amal, it's almost time to go to an iftar here, so we just have time for one more question, unfortunately. Suwar Ibrahim asks, how can we help stop Islamophobia?
That's a very powerful question. I think knowing what's going on with the Muslim communities in the West is very powerful. I mean, the proximity that this country has with France, for example, is it's worth noting. And right now, I think of all the Muslims in the West, I think the Muslim women in France have it harder than anyone else, and really the Muslims in general. And having awareness and supporting and reaching out and reading the poetry and the literature of these individuals and knowing that Islam, it doesn't look one way. Islam is about oneness, it is about tawheed. But understanding the depths and what these other communities are going through, it becomes our duty, number one, to appreciate our religion and know our religion more. That should be above everything else, right? We shouldn't think that just because we grow up in a Muslim country that khalas, we know everything. It's not the case at all. But appreciate the gravity of this faith and that people are literally losing their lives in the US, sometimes for just being Muslims. Women are fighting for their rights in places like France simply to be visibly Muslim. We should know our communities. We should hear what they have to say. And above all, we should make sure that when it comes to our own communities, we are correcting the ways that are not correct. We need to destigmatize things like mental health. Mental health is a crisis in the Muslim world right now. And we're so ashamed of it. And we're so quiet about it. But like the Ummah is hurting right now. We have issues and we need to talk about them. And don't obsess with what the West is going through. Know what's happening to your brothers and sisters. Know that they are doing a good job holding it down. But come back to your own community and think, how can we guide our own communities to be on the prophetic way? How can we improve the own illnesses here, right? We should all be healing our own communities so that collectively, globally, we can become more healthy and more unified, inshallah. So that's my advice for you all.
Thank you so much for being with us today, Amal. We really hope to have you in person one day in Algeria. You've never visited Algeria or anywhere in North Africa, or have you?
No, but I have eaten the food, and my Arabic teacher was Algerian, actually, so it counts for something.
Did you learn any Daraja, or it was just Fusha?
Fusha, that's it. But I'll be sure to pick some up before I come.
Okay. Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure to have you with us today. And Sahha Ramadanik, as they say in Algeria. I'm sure you can get the drift of that. And have a wonderful iftar.
I appreciate you all too. I still have maybe 7 hours before it's time to break fast. Thank you, Khalid. Thank you, everybody from the U.S. Embassy. I really appreciate this opportunity. Hosted me graciously.
Thank you and good night.